Have you ever wondered why the same painful patterns keep showing up in relationships, as if some invisible force is writing the same script over and over with different actors? What if a simple test could decode that script and finally reveal why connections feel so difficult? This is what the attachment style test that will change your dating life is all about. Are you ready? Because understanding this single psychological framework might be the difference between repeating the same mistakes forever and finally building relationships that actually work. Here's what makes attachment style tests so powerful. They're not like personality quizzes that tell someone which fictional character they resemble. These tests measure something fundamental: how the nervous system responds to intimacy, vulnerability, and closeness. Think about it. Every person walks into relationships with an invisible instruction manual written in childhood, dictating how to handle emotional connection. Most people never read that manual. They just keep following its instructions without realizing those instructions exist. Attachment-style tests make the manual visible, and once it becomes visible, everything changes. The framework itself is beautifully simple. 4 main categories capture how people relate in close relationships. Secure attachment looks like comfort with both intimacy and independence. These folks enjoy closeness without clinging and value independence without disappearing. Anxious attachment shows up as intense craving for connection combined with constant worry about abandonment. People with this style often feel like they love more than they're loved. Avoidant attachment appears as strong need for independence and discomfort with too much emotional closeness. These individuals often feel suffocated by others' needs, and disorganized attachment mixes high anxiety with high avoidance, creating an internal war between desperately wanting connection and fearing it simultaneously. 4 categories, but infinite variations in how they play out in real life. Which raises an interesting question. Why are these patterns so consistent? Here's where the science gets fascinating. Attachment styles form in early childhood based on interactions with primary caregivers. The infant brain is essentially asking one question on repeat. When distressed, will someone come? Will they respond to needs consistently? If the answer is usually yes, secure attachment develops. The nervous system learns that connection is safe and reliable. But if caregivers are inconsistent, sometimes responsive, sometimes dismissive, anxious attachment forms. The brain learns to stay hypervigilant, constantly monitoring for signs of abandonment. If caregivers are emotionally distant or punishing of emotional needs, avoidant attachment develops. The brain learns that expressing needs leads to rejection, so it's safer to not need anything at all. And if caregivers are frightening or chaotic, disorganized attachment emerges. The very person who should provide safety becomes a source of fear. These patterns get encoded deeply, becoming automatic responses that activate in adult relationships without conscious awareness. But here's what most people miss entirely. Attachment styles aren't personality traits. They're adaptive survival strategies. A child who develops anxious attachment in response to inconsistent care isn't broken or flawed. That child is brilliantly adapting to their environment by staying vigilant and pursuing connection intensely. A child who becomes avoidant isn't cold or unloving. That child learned that emotional independence is safer than vulnerability. The nervous system is doing exactly what it should, learning from experience and adjusting behavior to maximize survival. The problem is that strategies that worked in childhood often create suffering in adult relationships. The hypervigilance that kept an anxious child connected to an inconsistent parent becomes the clinginess that pushes away adult partners. The emotional independence that protected an avoidant child from rejection becomes the distance that prevents genuine intimacy. The strategies are still running, but the context has completely changed. Which brings up something crucial. Taking an attachment style test isn't about getting a label, it's about gaining a map. Most people navigate relationships feeling confused and reactive, wondering why the same problems keep emerging. The test provides a framework for understanding those patterns. Suddenly, behaviors that seemed random or shameful make perfect sense. The constant need for reassurance isn't neediness. It's an activated attachment system trying to maintain connection. The impulse to create distance after intimacy isn't commitment phobia. It's a nervous system protecting against perceived engulfment. The test translates feelings and behaviors into a comprehensible language. And once that language exists, communication becomes possible, both with partners and with the internal system that's been running the show all along. The actual tests themselves are surprisingly accessible. Most take 5 to 15 minutes and involve simple questions about relationship preferences and emotional responses. Questions like, how comfortable are you depending on romantic partners? Or, how often do you worry that your partner doesn't really love you? Or, do you prefer to keep parts of yourself private even from close partners? The questions map directly onto attachment dimensions: comfort with closeness, fear of abandonment, value placed on independence, ease with vulnerability. Popular versions exist on sites like The Attachment Project, Psychology Today, Verywell Mind, and others. Many are free. The questions feel personal but not invasive, more like a conversation with a perceptive friend than a clinical assessment. And here's what makes them particularly valuable. The results don't just assign a category. Good tests provide nuanced explanations of patterns, triggers, and relationship tendencies. Someone might learn their anxious leaning, which means they generally function securely, but specific situations, like a partner needing space or being uncommunicative, trigger anxious responses. Or they might discover they're fearful avoidant, sometimes called disorganized, which explains why they simultaneously crave and fear intimacy. The specificity helps. It's one thing to know relationships are hard. It's another thing entirely to understand when partners need alone time. The nervous system interprets this as rejection, triggering protest behaviors like excessive texting or picking fights to re-establish connection. That level of clarity creates opportunities for change. But here's where things get really interesting. In today's dating world, attachment styles have become something of a phenomenon. Social media is flooded with content about attachment theory. TikTok hashtags like #attachmentstyle have billions of views. Instagram therapists explain anxious avoidant traps to millions of followers. Reddit communities dedicated to attachment theory buzz with people sharing test results and relationship stories. This mainstream awareness has fundamentally shifted dating culture in fascinating ways. Some people now include their attachment style in dating app bios, right alongside height and occupation. One app called Ready even categorizes users by attachment style and uses it for matchmaking. The idea being that secure people should match with secure people, or at least that knowing styles up front prevents incompatible pairings. Whether this actually works remains debatable, but the trend reveals something important. People are hungry for frameworks that explain relationship struggles, and attachment theory provides exactly that, a scientifically grounded explanation that feels both validating and actionable. But here's where opinions diverge sharply. Some people credit attachment style awareness with completely transforming their dating lives. They tell stories of finally understanding why they kept choosing emotionally unavailable partners, or why they sabotaged good relationships, or why intimacy felt terrifying. Armed with this awareness, they made different choices. They recognized red flags earlier. They communicated needs more clearly. They chose partners based on compatibility rather than intensity. These success stories populate online communities and therapy offices, but there's also significant skepticism. Some critics argue that attachment labels have become pop psychology buzzwords, that people use to avoid accountability. "Sorry, that's just my avoidant attachment" becomes an excuse rather than an explanation, or the labels create fatalistic thinking. "I'm anxious avoidant, so relationships will always be hard." The framework can be weaponized during conflicts or used to stereotype potential partners before giving them a fair chance. This tension between helpful tool and limiting label is worth exploring deeper. The key distinction lies in how the information gets used. Attachment style awareness becomes transformative when it increases understanding without creating rigidity. Someone learns they're anxiously attached and uses that knowledge to recognize when they're seeking reassurance compulsively, to practice self-soothing instead of immediately texting a partner, to communicate needs without apologizing for having them. That's using the framework as a map for growth. But someone who learns they're anxiously attached and decides this means relationships will always be painful, or secure people probably won't want me, has turned the map into a cage. The information is identical. The application couldn't be more different. And this is why context matters so much. Attachment styles aren't fixed destinies. They're tendencies that can shift with new experiences, therapy, conscious practice, and, crucially, secure relationships. Research shows that people can develop what's called earned secure attachment. They might start anxious or avoidant, but through self-work and healthy relational experiences, they build more secure ways of relating. The nervous system is remarkably plastic. It can learn new patterns. An anxious person who consistently practices self-regulation and partners with someone secure may gradually feel less hypervigilant. An avoidant person who slowly opens to vulnerability with a patient partner may discover that intimacy doesn't always lead to engulfment. The test result is a starting point, not an end point. It describes current patterns, not permanent traits. This distinction is absolutely critical. Otherwise, the whole framework becomes deterministic rather than liberating. So how does someone actually use this information effectively? First, take the test without overthinking it. Answer honestly based on how relationships usually feel, not how they should feel or how things are in the absolute best or worst moments. Most tests take the average across responses to determine style. Some people score clearly in one category. Others land between categories or show different styles in different contexts. All of this is normal and useful information. Second, read the detailed results with curiosity rather than judgment. The goal isn't to feel bad about having an insecure attachment style. Most people aren't securely attached. Insecure attachment is common, understandable, and changeable. The goal is understanding patterns well enough to recognize them in real time. Third, share results with partners if the relationship feels safe enough. Having a shared language for attachment dynamics can transform how couples navigate conflict. Instead of "you're being clingy," it becomes "your anxious attachment is activated right now." Instead of "you're emotionally distant," it becomes "you're in avoidant mode." The language reduces blame and increases compassion. But this only works in relationships with baseline safety and respect. In toxic dynamics, the language can become ammunition. Fourth, use the results to inform dating choices going forward. This doesn't mean only dating secure people, though that certainly makes things easier. It means recognizing when attachment patterns are creating suffering rather than growth. If someone who's anxious keeps dating avoidant people and feeling progressively worse about themselves, that's valuable information. Maybe the pattern needs to change. If someone who's avoidant keeps attracting anxious partners and feeling smothered, perhaps there's unconscious selection happening that's worth examining. The test results illuminate these patterns, making them easier to interrupt. Fifth, consider therapy or coaching focused on attachment. Many therapists now specialize in attachment-based work, helping clients understand their patterns and develop more secure relating skills. This isn't about fixing something broken, it's about updating strategies that no longer serve. And sixth, remember that attachment styles show up everywhere, not just romantic relationships. They influence friendships, work relationships, even connections with children. Understanding attachment patterns creates insights across all relational contexts. Now here's something that often surprises people. Attachment styles can vary somewhat across relationship types. Someone might be relatively secure with friends but anxious in romantic relationships, or secure with romantic partners but avoidant with family. This variation reveals that attachment isn't purely an internal trait. It's also contextual, influenced by relationship dynamics and past experiences in that specific context. Romantic relationships trigger attachment systems most intensely because they involve the greatest vulnerability and dependence. This is why someone can be totally functional and confident at work, but become unrecognizably anxious with romantic partners. Different contexts activate different attachment strategies. The test results usually focus on romantic attachment, but the insights often apply more broadly. This contextual nature is actually good news. It means change is possible. If attachment were truly hardwired and unchangeable, shifting it would be nearly impossible. But since it's partially context-dependent, creating new relational contexts can shift attachment patterns, which leads to perhaps the most important insight. Secure relationships create secure attachment. It's not just individual therapy or self-work, though those help tremendously. Actually, experiencing consistent, responsive, emotionally available connection rewires the nervous system over time. An anxious person who dates someone secure may initially feel suspicious or bored, but if they stay and allow the relationship to unfold, the nervous system gradually learns that consistency is real. Hypervigilance decreases, trust builds. Similarly, an avoidant person with a secure partner who respects boundaries while gently inviting connection may slowly discover that vulnerability isn't dangerous. The walls come down incrementally. This is why choosing partners wisely matters so much. Relationships aren't just pleasant experiences, they're developmental environments that shape attachment patterns for better or worse. Dating incompatible attachment styles reinforces insecurity. Dating compatible or secure styles supports earned security. The people chosen as partners literally help write the next chapter of the attachment story. That's a profound responsibility on both sides. So here's what taking an attachment style test actually provides. It offers a psychological mirror, reflecting patterns that have been operating invisibly. It provides language for experiences that previously felt confusing or shameful. It reveals why certain situations trigger intense emotions while others feel manageable. It shows which relationship dynamics will be easier versus harder. It illuminates unconscious selection biases that keep drawing the same kinds of partners, and perhaps most importantly, it opens the door to change. Because patterns that remain unconscious control behavior. Patterns that become conscious can be examined, questioned, and eventually transformed. The test is a tool for bringing those patterns into awareness. What happens next depends entirely on how that awareness gets used. Taking this test and understanding attachment styles isn't just about improving romantic relationships, though that's certainly valuable. It's about understanding how the past shapes the present, how childhood experiences continue influencing adult behavior, how nervous systems adapt to environments, and how those adaptations can be updated when environments change. It's developmental psychology made practical and personal. And in a culture where relationships often feel confusing, unpredictable, and painful, having a framework that makes sense of that confusion is genuinely powerful. So the question becomes, is someone ready to see their patterns clearly? Ready to understand why relationships have felt the way they've felt? ready to stop repeating cycles and start making conscious choices. Because that's what this test offers. Not a personality label, not a diagnosis, but a map. And maps are only useful to people who've decided they're ready to navigate differently. Here's what to do with all of this. First, if the topic resonates at all, take an attachment style test. Choose one from a reputable source, the Attachment Project, Psychology Today, or similar sites with research-backed assessments. Set aside 15 minutes when there's privacy and mental space. Answer honestly. Read the results thoroughly. Don't just skim the category label. Read the detailed explanation of patterns, triggers, and relationship tendencies. Notice what feels accurate and what doesn't. Some parts will resonate deeply, others might not fit. That's all useful information. The test is giving data about internal patterns. Pay attention to emotional responses while reading results. Does it feel relieving to see patterns named, shameful, validating? Those emotions matter. They reveal how the patterns have been experienced internally. Second, reflect on relationship history through this new lens. Think about past partnerships and how they unfolded. Do patterns emerge? Maybe every relationship started intensely but ended with the same complaints about clinginess or distance. Maybe secure relationships felt boring, while chaotic ones felt exciting. Maybe there's a tendency to pursue people who are emotionally unavailable. The test results provide a framework for understanding these patterns. They transform relationships never work out into anxious avoidant pairings, create predictable dynamics that feel painful. That shift from helplessness to understanding is powerful. It suggests that different choices might produce different outcomes. Third, start noticing attachment patterns in real time. This is where the information becomes truly transformative. When anxiety spikes in a relationship, pause and ask, is this anxious attachment activating? Is the nervous system responding to a real threat or to a perceived one based on past experiences? When the impulse to create distance emerges, question it. Is this avoidant attachment protecting against vulnerability that isn't actually dangerous? These real-time observations gradually build the capacity to choose responses rather than just react. It's the difference between being run by patterns and gradually gaining agency over them. Fourth, if currently in a relationship, consider sharing the framework with a partner. This works best when approached collaboratively rather than accusatorially. Not you're avoidant and that's why you're distant. But learning about attachment styles has helped make sense of some of our patterns. Want to take these tests together and discuss them? Couples who understand each other's attachment styles often report feeling less defensive during conflict and more compassionate toward each other's triggers. The framework becomes a shared language for navigating difficult moments. Fifth, use this information to inform future dating choices. This doesn't mean discriminating against people with insecure attachment or only seeking secure individuals. It means recognizing which dynamics tend to be generative and which tend to be destructive. If anxious avoidant pairings have consistently created suffering, maybe it's time to try something different. If secure people have always seemed boring, maybe that boredom is worth investigating rather than immediately dismissing. If intense chemistry has always preceded painful breakups, maybe intensity isn't the best indicator of compatibility. Let the patterns speak. They're revealing something important about which relational environments support well-being and which undermine it. Sixth, consider professional support for deeper attachment work. Many therapists specialize in attachment-focused therapy. They help clients understand their patterns, heal attachment wounds, and develop earned security. This work can be profoundly transformative. It goes beyond just understanding patterns to actually rewiring them. If relationships have been consistently painful, if attachment patterns feel deeply entrenched, if childhood experiences were traumatic, Professional support can accelerate healing in ways that self-help can't match. And finally, practice self-compassion throughout this process. Attachment patterns aren't character flaws. They're intelligent adaptations to challenging circumstances. An anxious attachment style doesn't mean someone is needy or broken. It means they adapted brilliantly to inconsistent care by developing vigilance. An avoidant attachment style doesn't mean someone is cold or incapable of love. It means they learned that independence is safer than vulnerability. These patterns made sense once. They protected against real pain. Honoring that while also recognizing when they no longer serve is the work. It's not about blame or shame. It's about understanding and updating. The emotional truth beneath all of this is both challenging and liberating. Most people walk through relationships feeling confused about why things keep going wrong, wondering if something fundamental is broken inside them, or if they're just unlucky, or if good relationships are even possible. The attachment framework answers those questions clearly. Things go wrong not because someone is broken, but because unconscious patterns are creating predictable dynamics. Those patterns made sense in childhood, but create suffering now. And most importantly, those patterns can change. Taking an attachment style test is the first step in that change. It makes invisible patterns visible, it transforms confusion into clarity, and it opens the possibility of writing a different story. One where relationships feel secure, connected, and genuinely fulfilling rather than anxious, distant, or chaotic. This isn't about finding perfect partners or having perfect relationships. It's about understanding the internal programming that shapes relational experiences and deciding whether that programming still serves. It's about recognizing that the patterns bringing someone to this moment can be transformed through awareness, practice, and new experiences. It's about believing that secure attachment is possible, not as a birthright, but as something that can be earned through conscious work. The test is simply the map. The journey is what happens next. And that journey, challenging as it might be, could genuinely change everything. So the question remains, are you ready? Ready to see the patterns clearly, ready to understand why relationships have felt the way they've felt, ready to make different choices going forward. Because that readiness, more than anything else, determines whether the attachment style test that will change your dating life actually changes anything. The information is there, the framework exists. What happens with it comes down to willingness to look honestly, work patiently, and choose differently. And for anyone who's ready for that work, the test is waiting. Take it, read the results carefully, and then decide what comes next.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel. Because you deserve beautiful relationships.